The Orillia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Hey, hi everyone, welcome to the talk this evening, and thank you for your ongoing support for the OMAH History Speaker Series. Thank you to the OMAH History Committee for their work behind the scenes to recruit our excellent speakers, to coordinate and execute all moving parts that make these talks happen, and to Deanne McCullum-Rogers for recording our history speakers for viewing on Rogers Cable, enabling us to share our talks with a wider audience. Our speaker tonight is Dave Dawson, Community Editor for OrilliaMatters. Our talk this evening is Evolution, Packet's Death Spawn's Birth of Digital Newspaper. The Orillia Packet and Times was near and dear to our hearts. We depended on the paper to keep us updated on the community, and in November 2017, it was killed off with no notice. Thank you, Dave, for sharing your story about the death and rebirth of good journalism in our community. So a quick bio about Dave. He was born and raised in Orillia, a centennial baby. He grew up in a home at the south end of Matchadash Street, the youngest of 5 kids. He went to Central School, Harriet Todd Public School, Coochin Heights Public School, and ODCVI. After graduating from University of Windsor in 1990, he became a reporter and editor for the Amherstburg Echo before returning to Orillia in November of 1991 to become a sports reporter for the Packet and Times. He soon became the Packet sports editor, then served as a night editor, city editor, and news editor before leaving to become a freelance journalist. But he never really left writing and editing for the local daily newspaper regularly until its untimely demise in 2017. In 2018, he became the community editor of OrilliaMatters, and while he continues in that role, he also is the regional editor for Village Media, overseeing sites in Barrie, Collingwood, Midland, Bradford, Innisfil, and Newmarket. So over to you, Dave.
I was at an event in Orillia a little while ago, and as happens at these types of things, struck up a conversation with someone I didn't know. After she learned I was the editor of OrilliaMatters, she asked me about my journey to this role. Naturally, I told her with pride that I had started at the Packet, where I learned the ropes and began to hone my craft. She had a bit of a blank look on her face, and she asked, "What is the Packet?" Her question was a bit of a punch to the gut. In my world, the Packet is like a touchstone, an important part of my history and the heritage of this strange and wonderful place called Orillia. But it made me quickly realize that time marches on, and for some, the Packet has already faded from the headlines, so to speak. So let's start with the Packet. As many of you will know, the Packet and Times was what we proudly called the newspaper of record in Orillia for generations. It started in 1867 as the Expositor by George Hughes Hale, among others, and became the Northern Light a year later. The name, the Packet, made its first appearance on November 16, 1870, under William M. Hale, and originated from that same office as the Northern Light. Later, the Hale brothers joined forces and continued to publish the Packet from that same office. The Orillia Times became the community's third paper and operated as a newspaper until H.T. Blackstone purchased it in 1890. It was then carried on by his son George, and in 1926, the Times and the Packet merged. The Orillia Packet and Times was owned and edited by Charles Harold Hale and James Russell Hale and Blackstone. It was the dawn of a new era in Orillia. C.H. Hale's name quickly became synonymous with Orillia. His association with journalism in Orillia spanned 65 years. He started as what was known as a printer's devil and rose to become editor. He championed many causes and, according to the Hall of Fame, of which he is an esteemed member, Hale maintained a high standard of ethical journalism, never stooping to sensationalism, and his editorials were widely read across Canada. After the Second World War, the Hale brothers sold the paper to J.T. Dutrisac. In 1950, the corporate ownership era began when Thomson Newspapers bought the Packet and Times. It became a daily newspaper on November 5, 1953, in what was a huge moment in the life of the Packet. To be a daily is what every newspaper wanted to be. In 1967, exactly 100 years after its birth, the Packet moved into its new, modern, custom-built home on Coburn Street, a two-story landmark in downtown Orillia that still stands today. From there, 2 editions were published daily for more than 30,000 readers in Orillia, northern Simcoe County, and Muskoka. Believe it or not, copies were mailed throughout Canada, the United States, Africa, Britain, and continental Europe. Back then, more than 50 employees worked in 7 distinct departments at the Packet: editorial, classified and display advertising, administration, circulation, composing, and press. The common goal, of course, of each department was to get the news to the readers. It was a time when the paper was delivered, usually by kids and teens, to almost every household in town. It was a highly anticipated ritual to read the paper at around the dinner hour each day, and in those pages the history of the town unfolded. Legends were born and destroyed. If it wasn't in the Packet, it didn't happen. That was the Packet I grew up knowing. My parents, like most, subscribed to the Packet and were voracious readers each day. My parents also owned a cleaning company in town, and one of their longtime commercial clients was the Packet. And that's how I was introduced to the bustling business at 31 Coburn Street East. As a young lad, I would go with my parents and siblings after hours to help them clean various places, including the Packet. Most of those places were dark and devoid of people. The Packet was different. There were always people there, no matter the time of the day or night. To me, a lover of sports who followed all the local teams through the coverage in the Packet, it seemed like a magical place. When you walked in the building, you could smell the ink. If the presses were running, you could feel their vibrations throughout the building. You could just feel the energy. I remember watching the ticker tape spew out of the wall on the second floor, bringing stories to Orillia from all over the world. The language in the newsroom in those days was colorful. The intensity was high. I remember talking to sports editor Steve Milton and being in awe. It was during those days that journalism seeped into my blood. It got a hold of me. I knew then what I wanted to do with my life. A few years later at ODCVI, teacher Marilyn McCarrow, among others, nurtured that passion. They supported my goals and provided constructive feedback. After studying journalism and graduating from the University of Windsor, I got my first job as a reporter at a family-owned weekly newspaper. At the Amherstburg Echo, I was given the opportunity to learn all facets of the business, and I mean all of them. Once a week, reporters, editors, and everyone else would head down to the basement and insert flyers into the papers that had just been printed. Then, each in our personal cars, we would head out to various parts of town delivering that week's news. A few months after I became editor of a new regional paper the Echo started, and 18 months after I had started in Amherstburg, I got one of those phone calls. It was my dad. He told me the Packet Times was looking for a sports editor. Frankly, I felt reluctant to return home. Like so many people, I couldn't wait to get out of Orillia when I finished high school. But I decided I would apply, and if I got the job, we'd stay for a year or maybe a year and a half. After all, I had big dreams of becoming a beat writer for the Toronto Maple Leafs or perhaps the Toronto Blue Jays. But something funny and unexpected happened. We had kids, and we fell back in love with Orillia. And the Packet, home to unreasonable demands, amid a constant and critical shortage of staff was that weird mix of egos and talent and dreams and passion that just somehow worked. Part of it was the shared common passion for our work and our community. We felt we were doing something important, even vital, in the name of democracy and ensuring accountability of those who were in positions of power locally. For several years, I was the sports editor and headed up what those in the business like to call the toy department. That meant working a lot of nights and weekends to cover games and tournaments. It meant traveling throughout the region as our hockey and lacrosse teams, most notably, chased glory. I had a front row seat at the city's biggest sports event and was fortunate to chronicle the ups and downs of our city's top athletes. Equally important, I was able to tell the stories of the volunteers who made those things happen, of the high school students who had big league dreams, watched elementary school students fall in love with their chosen sport. In some cases, I witnessed young athletes come of age as they pursued their passions. But over time, I decided it was time to move over into the real world of news. At first, I became night editor, the guy who edits the late breaking news and lays out the primary news pages of the paper. It was a difficult role, in part because it meant I had to work 4 to midnight, but it also allowed me to have my fingerprints on the most important stories and the most read news pages of the packet every day. Later, I would become assignment editor, the guy who was responsible for coming up with giving each reporter enough assignments to keep them busy during their workday. It was also my job, of course, to call audibles and send reporters as necessary to cover breaking news or change gears and chase something that suddenly had become much more important that day. After that, I became the city editor, overseeing all aspects of the newsroom, and in each job there were different responsibilities, but one overarching task: to cover everything relevant at every moment, even as our numbers dwindled. And why were those numbers dwindling? Why was our newsroom, like newsrooms all over the country, shrinking? Were we not doing our job? Unfortunately, the answer has almost nothing to do with what we as reporters and editors were doing. It had everything to do with an industry rooted in traditions, an industry simply unwilling to adapt while intent on squeezing every single cent out of every single newspaper, with absolutely no regard for the product those communities relied on. The packet could be viewed as a microcosm of the entire industry. It started out as a family-owned enterprise driven by passion. It became something vital through the blood, sweat, and tears of the people who worked there. It became enmeshed in the fabric of the community, and it was part of its culture. Loved, hated, ridiculed, revered, sometimes all at once. However, people felt they knew it was important to read the packet. It employed a lot of people over the years, sponsored almost everything, championed the causes important to the community, and held those in power to account. If not for the packet, would the community have rallied to build a home for fire victim Joey Filion, turning a local story into an international one? Would the community have come together like never before to rebuild the Leacock Boathouse on a memorable weekend in 1995 without the packet rallying people to the cause? Conversely, would it have taken decades to build a new recreation facility if the packet wasn't constantly criticizing the process or the site or the politics? The MRF, or the multi-use recreation facility debate, dragged on for years and years, at least in part due to the packet's persistent and important coverage of the issues related to it. Or if the packet never caught wind of the plan to build a giant garbage-burning incinerator in the community, might that have happened? The fact is, the packet was a major player in the community in what happened and in what didn't happen. There were times when that power was likely exploited. Some thought we were too big for our britches, or too negative, or too self-important. They might have been right. But there was always a belief within the packet that what we were doing was vital. We didn't always agree internally about certain stances or certain approaches, but we took the approach of trying to look at the bigger picture and what is most important to the community at large in the long run. However, those that own the packet could care less about what we might call this noble pursuit. From Thomson, notoriously cheap owners who accounted for every pencil, to Hollinger, to Osprey, to Post Media, and other names I can't even remember. Their only concern was making money. Those owners, generally speaking, had an aversion for adaptation. They were entrenched in the past. Their only strategy was to cut, and cut some more. It became an almost annual event. Darkness would descend in November as newsrooms braced for cutbacks. Naturally, that climate had a major impact on everyone who toiled in the industry and specifically at the packet. People lost heart. Frustration roiled. Anger boiled. Many just were waiting for a buyout. Hope was seeping out the doors. For me, that toxic work culture became too much. And in 2005, I decided I had to get out. Sort of. I quit my full-time job as editor and became a freelancer. But I kept my foot in the door at the packet with a regular weekly Sunday editor shift and a new role as a freelance reporter while also doing freelance work for a variety of other entities. For me, it was like a shot of pure oxygen. I felt I could breathe again. And while I love my new roles outside of the packet, I also knew at some level I could not divorce myself from the city's newspaper. During those freelance years, the staff at the packet shrunk dramatically. Ironically, that meant more opportunities for me, and I found myself increasingly doing more and more work at the packet, albeit while working from home. We were probably the only newspaper in Canada whose editorials were written by a freelancer, me. The cutback trend, however, was happening all over the country. At that time, a handful of large corporations owned almost every newspaper in Ontario, and almost every newspaper was failing, losing market share, losing their footing. And it was no different in Orillia. The corporate owners had long ago removed the packet's all-important printing press in a cost-cutting measure. The packet was printed in Vaughan for years, forcing us to change our optimal morning deadline to a 10 p.m. deadline. That meant when people read their afternoon newspaper, the news was older and more stale than at any time in the packet's history. In another cost-cutting move prescribed by bottom-line driven owners, the packet sold its downtown landmark building and moved into a strip mall. It was, symbolically at least, demoralizing and disheartening. The good ship packet was in peril. As you may recall, the packet at one time was printed twice a day and reached up to 30,000 people daily in the region. More than 50 people worked together to make what people in the industry call the daily miracle. In the final days of the packet, circulation had plummeted. Less than 3,000 people were paying to read the packet in 2017. The newsroom was down to 2 full-time people. Over the years, the packet went from being a daily, published 7 days a week, to 5. The owners had taken a vibrant, vitally important community resource and systematically bled it dry. It was a sad shell of its once powerful past. Despite that, I'm not sure how many people thought the packet would abruptly close. I certainly didn't believe that was possible. Yet, when I woke up on November 27th, 2017, I did what I always did. I checked my work email account. Oddly, I could not access it. I assumed it was a technical issue and decided I would check it later. So I turned to Twitter to get caught up in the news, and that is when I found out that I and so many of my colleagues and peers in the province were out of work. Metroland and Post Media had decided to turn its properties into a giant monopoly board of sorts. Post Media opted to sell the Packet along with other deeply rooted papers in Barrie, Collingwood, and many other communities to make markets. They promptly closed the dailies like the Packet, and we, the employees, found out about our fate on social media. Perhaps even worse, the move was immediate. There was no chance for a final edition, a farewell to the community. The doors were locked, literally. The papers were dead. In Orillia, it left a community in shock. People were outraged. During a wake organized by then Mayor Steve Clark at Brewery Bay a few days later, some in the community were moved to tears to be without their paper and their voice. They say you never miss what you have until it's gone. That was certainly the case with the Packet. While many had stopped subscribing and grew frustrated with how it had withered, there was still a deeply seated affection for the paper, or for what it once was. That same sense of loss was being felt in communities all over Ontario and beyond. And sadly, it went way beyond newspapers. As this was happening, most radio stations and TV stations were experiencing similar economic storms. It is rare these days for a small local radio station to have a news reporter on staff. They often have newscasts, but don't do original reporting. They essentially read headlines from other sources. Similarly, many TV stations had been shuttered or scaled back. Big networks spent big bucks on national news coverage, but very few had local reporters in small communities like Orillia. But at least we had another paper, right? The Orillia Today had been a weekly paper published in Orillia for years. It was owned and operated by Metroland, who promised to commit resources to such papers when they shut down those dailies. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. Until recently, Orillia Today had just one reporter. Now they don't even have that. And they stopped their print edition and moved entirely online. But they only pay lip service to community news. How could they do otherwise with no staff? This is what can accurately be called a perfect storm, a horrible situation only rendered possible because of greedy owners who failed to adapt and endorsed a strategy that consisted of cutting employees, selling its buildings, regionalizing everything, and failing to recognize a landscape that had irrevocably changed. But from misery comes opportunity. And opportunity in this case was Village Media. Village Media's publicly stated goal is to strengthen the communities it serves. Think about that for a minute in the context of the approach and ethics of previous owners of newspapers like the Packet. When Orillia Matters got off to a strong start, Village Media recognized in us a success story, one that could be replicated. So, as part of their partnership with Google sent a 5-person production team from New York City to Orillia for 3 weeks. The goal was to capture that success story. I'd like to play that video for you now.
Everybody has a story. And in Orillia specifically, our daily newspaper told the city's stories for 147 years. There's not a person that you could talk to who wouldn't have something to say about how it touched their life. And I remember going into the newsroom as a young boy, and I kind of thought it was a noble pursuit to be telling people stories. That's when something inside me kind of clicked that there might be something in the future there for me. 26 years I worked there. I never went a day with my byline not being in the paper. That was like a badge of honor to me, because a daily newspaper in a community this size just becomes bigger than just a newspaper. But even though the engagement level is so high, there was never talk about growth or investing. It was all just about how can we save another dollar? How can we cut another person? And when we sold our presses and moved to a strip mall, that showed that we were going in the wrong direction. And when we found out that the paper was closing, it was devastating. It was personally devastating. You know, I was at an age where I was like, what am I gonna do career-wise? What's the community going to do without a daily newspaper? It was where they turned to find the big stories, the little stories, the news from the council chambers, the hockey score, an obituary. It was how people found out that people died. I mean, that's just the reality. So when that important news source is suddenly sucked away and there's nothing there, people really recognized what they were missing. What was happening was not acceptable in our community. There had to be a place where they make quality local news effectively and profitably. That's when I heard about Village Media and Jeff Elgie, who's the owner of the company.
Village Media is a digital-only publishing company focused on local news media. People still want that information about their community that they always got. What's been disrupted is where they get it from. So to us, it's, hey, let's take these great people, this great content, and move it over into this business model. So in Orillia, we were fortunate enough to be able to connect with the publisher from that daily paper, some of the regional reporters, and Dave, their regional editor. We work with Google in particular with their tools that can enable newsrooms to do much more powerful things that were never possible before.
Hey guys.
And so we say, look, there's a set of tools for you, so you don't have to worry about anything other than writing a great story, which you've always done. And I think for journalists, when they're focused on writing, they love it. And so we knew that the conditions were right, and we had confidence in the people. And so it was, let's do this. And within a month of the paper closing, we launched OrilliaMatters.
When we launched, our numbers were really strong. I could tell right away we were really onto something here. People were coming to our site in droves every day, every hour, every half hour. It just blew me away. I had a friend of mine yesterday say, I don't miss the newspaper anymore. Everything I need is right there at OrilliaMatters, and it's there quicker. I can get it easier. The paper doesn't get caught in my snowblower. I always thought, I would die a newspaper guy, but this new chapter has created something awesome. I think the future is brighter than we thought.
As I said in that video, something awesome has happened thanks to Village Media. Later this month, Village Media will open its 25th site devoted to local news when Aurora Today goes online. Village Media is one of the few media companies in Canada that is expanding and hiring. How is that possible? It's possible due to visionary owner Jeff Elgie, whom you just met on the video, and to a strategy that puts news gathering above everything else. That might be best explained by the OrilliaMatters story. As you may recall, publication of the packet ceased on November 25, 2017. It came out of nowhere, taking everyone by surprise. Yet OrilliaMatters went live online on January 1st, 2018, just 36 days later. That is a remarkably short period of time to essentially start a new newspaper from scratch. It's a testament to a company that is nimble and built to grow. It was scary in a way. However, it also felt like we had nothing to lose. So we put our heads down and we got to work. We started with John Hamill as publisher, Nicole Parks as a sales rep, myself as editor, and Nathan Taylor as a reporter. Each of us had deep roots in the packet, and I'm proud to say today that all four of us are still here working hard. But we are certainly not alone. Village Media had custom built a content management system that is light years ahead of everyone else. On top of that, there is support staff at the company's headquarters in Sault Ste. Marie that help not only with editorial function, but other areas such as human resources, legal, technology, and other important departments. Village Media found a way to create a model for digital newspapers that was frankly quite easy to replicate. And while each site is 100% autonomous, with all decisions made at the local level, a winning formula has been developed through various sites that have found success in markets large and small all over the world. The critical part of that success is the hiring of local journalists, people who know the community they serve. And Orillia Matters is the perfect example of that. One of the things that is a bit different about Village Media sites is that we print press releases that are submitted to us from community groups and organizations verbatim. We look at it as a service to the community. Having said that, just because we receive a press release does not mean we must publish it. We could choose not to. We could turn it into a story. It's up to the editor to decide those things. And while we mimic a newspaper in every way, by covering city council, breaking news, political shenanigans, etc., we now know definitively what people like to read and try to provide that. That is likely one of the biggest differences between digital sites and old-fashioned print newspapers. In the past, we never really knew how many people were reading what we wrote. Now, I can tell you how many people opened a story, how long on average people spent reading the story, how many photographs they looked at. The real-time analytics are available and easily accessible. Through those analytics, we quickly realized that the most popular stories, outside of police news and obituaries, were often stories about new businesses, new restaurants, or quirky stories. So when a new restaurant opens, we try to write a story about it. When there's a winter storm in April, we cover it. When the sign at Burger King blows over, we don't hesitate to write a story about it. As an aside, that one is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. A reader shot a 35-second video of the sign at Burger King blowing over, and we added an 80-word story. And the story was headlined, "Wild Wind a Whopper for Orillia Burger King sign." Ironically enough, it was easily the most viewed story of the month. And it proves a couple of things. A story doesn't have to be long, and the theme doesn't have to be serious to garner readers' attention. But I want to stress, and I can't say this enough, we don't chase analytics. We will never write clickbait headlines in an ill-conceived attempt to fool people into reading a story. Most importantly, we won't sacrifice the important stories for the popular ones. Coverage of city council is a good example of that. We are often the only news source covering a city council meeting these days. That, frankly, is scary, and it should be worrisome to everyone. So we take that responsibility, and it is very clearly a responsibility, seriously. We do our best to write fair, accurate, clear stories about every decision made at City Hall. Some of those stories, frankly, can be boring. Not everyone wants to read about wastewater treatment plants. And while I understand that, I believe that that type of story is important to write. Sure, sexy sells, but I like to think we're above that. We take our role as seriously as we can. And that's why it's so important that the reporters and editors that bring you the news each day are trained and experienced and live in the community. That packet DNA lives within us. That rich heritage of vital journalism drives us. In our hearts and minds, Orillia Matters is a newspaper in every important way. The difference really is simply how it's delivered and when it's available. It's delivered, of course, right to your phone or your iPad or your laptop or your computer, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. Yes, even on Christmas. Transformative technology is the key. Villager, a custom-made content management system, was developed in-house specifically for our news sites. It's easy to navigate, it's intuitive, and it almost never goes down. So what that means is a reporter can take photographs with his phone, write a story on his phone, and put it in our content management system on his phone. Depending on the reporter's experience level, he could publish that story to our site directly from the scene using his phone. However, more typically, an editor will edit it prior to publication. Think about that. Years ago, a photographer would take pictures and then head back to the darkroom to develop the film. A reporter would be on the scene doing interviews and then race back to the newsroom to write the story, all of which would likely be published in the next day's edition. Don't forget, you needed a whole other team of people to lay out the story in the paper, to make it fit around the ads in a confined space before it would be sent to another department that created plates that were then put on a press. Then it had to be printed. Then it had to be delivered. Think of how many steps are involved and how many people had their fingerprints on any given story back in the day. Today, thanks to this technology, we can publish a story within minutes of a major breaking event in the community. However, that is a bit of a double-edged sword. Being fast can sometimes mean being wrong. So we try to balance that need for speed with an underlying tenet that we must get it right, even if that means someone else can post it first. Accuracy and fairness are far more important to us than speed. We have also learned that to many of our readers, speed is overrated. Many of our readers are subscribers and wait until our email lands in their inbox at 3 p.m. to check out the news. At present, we have a little over 20,000 people who subscribe to our daily newsletter, and we know from the click rates that most of them read Orillia Matters every day. Many of them have told me that they view that as the newspaper. They take their time to go through all the news, the obituaries, the weather. Many do the Sudoku or crossword just as they did in the days when the newspaper was put in their mailbox each afternoon. One of the other ways the digital news site is different from a legacy newspaper is the way in which our readers can interact with us, with our journalists, and with other readers. From the day we started, there were many varied voices weighing in on our stories via our commenting mechanism. At first, most people were respectful. But to be honest, it was always a bit of a gong show. And then during the pandemic, things spiraled out of control. So on September 14th of 2021, we shut off the tap spewing gossip. It was the most controversial move we've made since we started publishing. Here's how I explained it in an editorial we published that day. The pandemic has brought out the best of people in many ways. Over the past 18 months, we've been heartened to share many of those stories. But as the coronavirus domination drags on, it is taking a toll in many different ways. Unfortunately, it seems to have robbed many of you of your common sense and your human decency. And sadly, that is all too often reflected in the hurtful comments you write, often under cowardly false pen names, below our stories. Many have nothing of value to say, but keep saying it over and over again, often at length and typically in hurtful and hateful language. We are all weary of ignorant ramblings, subtle but hurtful racism, and thinly and not so thinly veiled threats of violence. That ends today. We will no longer be a platform for toxicity and wild conspiracy theorists. This is not an easy decision, in that we strive to present a variety of viewpoints and want to provide a place, a virtual water cooler of sorts, where people can safely discuss the matters of the moment. But try as we might, this is no longer a safe place. We have spent countless hours trying to moderate the growing number of comments, and we do our best to filter out slurs of all sorts. However, many are just smart enough to find their way around such rules. While the comment sections are now gone, in their place at the bottom of our stories, you will find a new feedback option that prompts readers to add to the story. It allows you, dear reader, to enter a thoughtful response to the story you've just read. Submissions will be reviewed by local newsroom staff, and a selection will be posted as part of a weekly roundup of reader feedback. But be forewarned, we will not publish prejudice or cheap shots, and will not provide a platform for childish name-calling or trolling, so don't waste your time. Of course, if you really want to weigh in on a local matter, feel free to do what readers have done for hundreds of years. Write a letter to the editor. As has been our policy since day one, we will only publish letters from real people with real names and identities we've confirmed via phone prior to publication. Frankly, it's a sad commentary that we must take this step. Our hope is that it also serves another purpose, allowing us to get on with what should be our top priority, informing you on the critical issues that face our community. After publishing that editorial for the first time, I was worried about what I'd written. Even though I knew it was the right thing to do, I was concerned that we might face an overwhelming backlash from people holding pitchforks and calling for freedom of speech. But perhaps surprisingly, the reaction was the opposite. Generally speaking, people applauded us for taking a stand and for removing that element of vitriol that turned our site into something ugly. Finally, in October of 2023, more than 2 years later, we introduced a new verified commenting system. Commenters who meet a specified criteria and continue to promote respectful dialogue receive a virtual badge that allows them access to comment directly to the site. Readers who are not verified may still comment, but those comments will be manually moderated before appearing under story. When we introduced verified commenting, we wrote another editorial about the whole idea. And here's what we said. We won't tolerate name calling, personal attacks, trolling, or veiled prejudice. Users whose posts are derogatory, defamatory, or discriminatory should expect to be permanently and unceremoniously relieved of their commenting privileges by our moderators. Despite that verified commenting system, we still don't allow comments on court stories, police-related stories, Indigenous stories, and coverage of other marginalized groups. We also don't allow comments on letters to the editors to prevent debate from spiraling down deep, dark rabbit holes. The good news is, generally speaking, verified commenting is working. It's not perfect, and we're constantly tweaking it, but the toxicity level, thankfully, has decreased dramatically. We've talked a lot about journalism today. Now I'd like to focus a bit on the business model, as I think it's important at this point to explain the revenue expense formula that Village Media has successfully employed since it began more than a decade ago. First off, we are a private company and we are not government funded. We do not receive subsidies from the government. However, we do have a few reporters across our network who are part of what's known as the Local Journalism Initiative. That is a federal government program aimed to provide funding for what's known as news deserts. We have to apply for these positions and make a case for the funding. It is an excellent program. For example, we have a civics reporter at our Midland Today site. He can only cover municipal issues in Midland, Penetanguishene, Tay, and Tiny Township. He can't, for example, go cover a fire or a murder. Outside of those parameters, the federal government has absolutely no say in what the reporter covers, and they are not involved in any way with what that reporter does every day. I think it's really important that you understand as well that Village Media is adamant that there will never be a paywall on its local news sites. That is born from a desire to make local news accessible to everyone on an equal basis. We will never force you to pay to access Orillia Matters. So how do we keep the lights on? It's simple. Advertising. We have sales reps out working hard to sell ads and campaigns that fund the gathering of news. So when you see an ad pop up when you're reading a story, it would be helpful if you clicked on that ad. That is what keeps us going. But there are other revenue streams, such as programmatic sales through a partnership with Google. There are what's known as community leaders programs that are sold to local businesses to support stories around a given theme, such as Bold or Pursuit or Helpers. You can find an example of those on our site. Just click on the tab called More to the right of news, and you will see those stories. It's important to understand the advertiser doesn't have any say in that content. They don't get to pick the stories, and they certainly don't get to read them before they're published. There's one thing we don't accept payment for: obituaries. I think we're the only entity on the planet that does not charge for the publication of obituaries. Once, when our company put out a call to staff for new ideas to make money, I suggested we charge a nominal fee for obituaries. At that time, it wasn't long after my mom had died, and I was shocked at how expensive it was, for example, to have an obituary published in Orillia Today. But our owner, Jeff Elgie, said he would not try to profit from those who were grieving. He also pointed out that on any given day, the most read section of our sites was the obituaries. They draw readers to our site every day. We also have a lot less expenses than legacy media. We almost all work from our home, though Orillia Matters does have a small office in downtown Orillia. The cost of real estate for a company is very low. We also don't need presses or people to lay out the stories, because every editorial employee is equipped with a phone, a laptop, and a camera. Quite honestly, we don't need much else. The most important takeaway from all of this, I think, is that investing in journalism and journalists works. It's profitable. While other companies shrunk dramatically during the pandemic, our growth continues. In fact, the number of staff at Village Media has more than doubled in recent years. We now employ 160 people, and 58% of those staff members are on the editorial side of the business. That is unheard of in our industry. It's a winning formula and something we know and can prove with tangible numbers. We track the traffic on each of our sites. Now, to be honest, numbers are down a little bit since Facebook decided to remove Canadian news from its social media site. The most important metric we use is what's known as page views. So each time a person opens a story, that is considered a page view. In April, Orillia Matters had 2.1 million page views. Now, that does not mean 2.1 million people came to our site, but it means that people opened 2.1 million stories to read. Orillia Matters is consistently the 5th highest read site among the 24 in our network. The only sites that have more page views on a monthly basis are much older than us and in much bigger centers: Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, North Bay, and Guelph. The reality is, from the day we started in 2018, Orillia Matters has been very well received in the community. Both advertisers and readers have been excellent, faithful supporters, and that has paved the way for growth at our site and well beyond. Today at Orillia Matters, I continue to serve as community editor, and we have 2 full-time reporters. We have another desk editor, several well-respected columnists that represent a wide array of voices, and many freelancers. When Orillia Matters started in 2018, Village Media's only site in our region was Barrie Today. That site had been up and running for a few years, but only had 1 full-time staffer. They were simply trying to establish themselves in one of Ontario's largest markets. But as Orillia took off, the company decided it was time to beef up the Barrie market and expand throughout Simcoe County. Today, Barrie Today has a full-time editor and 4 full-time reporters, along with its own stable of columnists and freelancers. In April, Barrie Today had more than 1.4 million page views. We also opened sites in Collingwood, Bradford, Newmarket, Midland, and Innisfil. I serve as the regional editor overseeing all 7 sites. I'm happy to say that now, on the news side, we have a total complement of 21 full-time reporters and editors working hard to tell the important stories in each of those communities. And it's not hyperbole to say we are now the dominant media outlet in each of those 7 markets. Looking outside Simcoe County through our 24 sites and other specialty publications, Village Media generates more than 30 million page views each month. While those numbers are impressive, quite honestly, they're not that important to me. Journalism is what's important to me. I like to think that at the local level, we're your eyes and ears at City Council, at County Council, at the school board, at the police services board, at the hospital, at the jail, in the arenas, in the boardrooms, wherever things that matter happen. It is our job to reflect the community. That means telling the stories of the disenfranchised, giving a voice to the voiceless. It means interpreting 100-page reports and breaking down financial analysis. It means listening. It means having hard conversations. It means being fearless. It's not easy and we're far from perfect, but it is what we strive for every day. One of the ways we strive to be accountable to our community is through an advisory board composed of our readers. In the spring of 2023, we put out a call seeking 6 to 10 people from different segments of the community and from very professional and personal backgrounds to sit on a new advisory board. The advisory board's mandate is to provide unbiased insights and ideas from a third-party point of view. In short, we wanted to help build better relationships with people and group whose information needs may not be met. We always want to hear more voices about what we are doing right, as well as highlighting areas where we could do better. Journalism is a craft, and that means always learning and consistently wanting to improve. We were blown away with more than 24 applications for our advisory board. It was not easy to whittle down that group to 10, but we did, and the group has met several times and has proven to be an invaluable resource for us. Members include a former First Nation chief, a former Orillia City Council, a current Lakehead University professor, current Georgian and Lakehead students, a longtime business owner, among others. It is a great group of respected community leaders that helps ensure we fulfill our mandate. In closing, I would like to thank you for listening today, and I'd be happy to take any questions from anyone. Thank you.
What should the owners of the packet have done to keep the packet up and running? That sounds like a nursery rhyme.
Yes. Well, I think what the owners did was they tried to keep one foot in the past and then add a finger into the future. And so, in the dying moments of the newspaper part of the world, in the packet, for example, they were trying in very, in baby steps to have an online presence. I remember when we were told to, I think we were supposed to post the first 2 paragraphs of a story on our website to encourage people to buy the paper, which of course just left people very frustrated and didn't work. And then we would publish all our stories to the website once the paper was printed. So it was just a terrible, disjointed strategy. This is not a surprise. This was a surprise to no one that our industry was going this way. They just generally were reluctant to invest. Like if they just invested in some of the technology that our company did, there's never any reason to close a paper like the packet. They could have easily done both properly. They could have complemented one another, but they just. The problem was, and I think the other problem is it was absentee ownership, generally speaking. So they weren't in the community. They didn't, when I'm in the community every day, I have people constantly coming up to me and asking me about certain things. Why didn't you do this? Why did you do this? Why don't you cover this? That kind of thing. So we get that sense of what the community is talking about pretty clearly and quickly. But the absentee owners never felt that. All they look at, and it's sad, but it's true, was the bottom line. They were just trying to make more money. And the easiest way to do that is to cut salaries, to sell buildings, so it's like, I have no sympathy for the owners of legacy media. I don't think they should get any breaks. I don't think the government should support them. This is completely my opinion. They authored their own story, and, they could have done things so differently.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to send it over to Trish and some comments.
Okay, great. So thanks very much, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for your attendance tonight and for your ongoing support. I also like to say special thanks to Dave for being our guest speaker tonight and sharing with us the history of the Orillia Packet and Times, as well as your own personal memories, both good and bad. Gave us a good lens on the whole journalist relationship with the community and what was going on during those times. So we really appreciate that. And also congrats on the successful transition to the digital era with the OrilliaMatters launch, and that took over where the packet left off. Your efforts, along with your team, the local journalists, Village Media, is much appreciated to make sure that Orillia has a continued local news source to keep everyone in this community aware of what's going on. It's so vital. So thank you very, very much for your commitment to the community on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And I would also like to thank the History Committee as the chair for their continued collaboration and research in sourcing such a fine roster of presenters for our OMAH Speaker Series. Our next speaker before our summer hiatus will be Amanda Marino, Experienced Development Officer of the Stephen Leacock Museum, who will present a Leacock love story on June 19th at 7 via Zoom. Amanda will explore the relationship between Stephen Leacock, one of Canada's most internationally successful writers, who moved to Orillia for the summer months in 1929, and talk about the women in his life, especially the very touching and emotional love story of Stephen and his wife, Beatrix Hamilton Leacock. So don't forget to register on OMAH's website. And please know that former History Committee member Fred Blair will have his article, The Cracked Bell Caper of 1900, featured in OMAH's next newsletter on May 23rd. Fred's a local family historian, and he unearthed an article originally published in the Orillia Packet and Times on December 24th, 1956. That recollects a scandal involving the two sons of well-respected Reverend Canon Richard Green when they got into some hot water at the church. So stay tuned for that in your e-newsletter. So thank you again for your ongoing support of local history through these speaker series, and we'll see you again in June. Thank you and good evening.